This episode is brought to you by Progressive. Progressive helps you compare direct auto rates from a variety of companies so you can find a great one, even if it's not with them. Quote today at Progressive.com to find a rate that works with your budget. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, April 2000, presidential candidate George W. Bush meets with a group known as the Austin 12, a group of gay Republicans, to talk about how he can better reach LGBTQ voters. Afterwards, Bush declared that the interaction had made him, quote, a better man. The New York Times had referred to gay Republicans as, quote, the tiniest sliver of his party's electorate, but it was a sliver that was getting a good amount of attention in the 2000 GOP primary. All of the candidates, like John McCain and Elizabeth Dole, had extended olive branches to gay voters. And this was the era, if you remember, we're coming off of the 90s culture wars, and there was talk of the Republican Party as a big tent and compassionate conservatism. Of course, the culture wars and the religious dynamics had not gone away, and on questions of policy, like gay marriage, both parties still had a long, long way to go. But it is a very fascinating moment, this visit between Bush and the Austin 12, and we have the perfect guest joining us to discuss. Neil J. Young, writer and historian and author of the new book, Coming Out Republican, A History of the Gay Right. It is available right now. So Neil, welcome to the show and congratulations on the new book.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me.
And I left out the most important part of your bio, which is that Neil is one of the co-hosts of the brilliant podcast Past Present, which he's done for many years alongside our very own Nicole Hemmer. So I will also welcome Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So I guess this counts as a crossover episode of sorts. It's a nice Venn. It's a Venn diagram episode, if not a formal crossover episode. But yeah,
I get to sit in the middle.
Exactly. But Neil, thank you so much for doing this. So obviously, your book is a sweeping history. I want to get to some of that and bring it to the present. But how about this meeting in 2000 during the primary? Who are the Austin 12 and why is George W. Bush meeting with them?
So the Austin 12 are a group of 11 gay men and one lesbian. All of them are Republicans, and all of them are supporters of George W. Bush in the 2000 election. He is their guy in the primaries, and many of them are affiliated with an organization called Log Cabin Republicans, which is the nation's oldest and largest gay Republican organization. But this crew, the 12 that goes to Austin and meets with him on April 13th, 2000, they are supporters of George Bush, and they want him to have a gay-friendly reputation because they believe that is essential for him doing well in the election, particularly appealing to suburban moderates and swing voters, and also that they hope that he and his compassionate conservatism will be a gay-friendly Republican president once he's elected.
It's interesting. There's one of the names of the Austin 12 that stuck out to me, and I think it helps us to understand the shift that's happening in this moment. In the 1990s, the Republicans got a reputation, or sharpened their reputation, as a very mean party, right? There was just like a lot of, not just like hateful rhetoric, but also just like kind of bitchy rhetoric on the right. And one of the people who is part of this Austin 12 is a former Wisconsin congressman named Steve Gunderson. And Gunderson in 1994 is forcibly outed on the floor by Bob Dornan, another Republican. I think he's the only Republican to vote against the Defense of Marriage Act. And he really, like, once he's outed, takes these very pro-gay policy stances. But he's in just like an interesting position in the party as somebody who is sort of the target of anti-gay politicians.
That's right. And, Bob Dornan was this just firebrand from California. He does really ugly stuff in general. The outing on the floor of Congress is particularly vitriolic. It's actually during a debate over some funding about public school systems in the country, and it's tied to LGBT-friendly curriculum that was being developed. And he really grossly outs Gunderson in a way that actually backfires. Gunderson is, easily able to take the higher road there, and it certainly isn't a problem for him and his constituents in Wisconsin. But it's a moment that I think it sort of encapsulates the ugliness of anti-gay Republican politics in the 90s, set against, of course, the backdrop of the HIV/AIDS crisis, which is inflaming so much of that rhetoric and just the ugliness of the era.
It seems to me that like some of the conversation is just about like decency, you know, like how do we just be respectful? How do we interact as human beings and not sort of like mudsling every single time, you know, we're in each other's presence, which feels like a very low bar. I mean, we're not talking about policy. We're not talking about like legislative changes. This is all like, how can we show, which I hate this word, but like tolerance was the word that got thrown around a lot. None of these words age very well today, but back then that was sort of, it felt like a goalpost.
Yeah.
Yeah, that idea of Bush sitting down with 12 LGBTQ Republicans who support him, and his takeaway is, wow, that made me a better man.
Yeah.
That idea that it's all happening on this affective level and not on a policy level or anything like that, and that, oh, look how tolerant I am. I sat down with these gay people.
You're human. Wow.
But Neil, you know, in your first answer, I mean, I noted, like you said, they were there to talk to him about his reputation, right?
Yes.
Not sit down and talk to him about policy. And so really was that kind of the substance of the meeting, was like, how can you come off as more gay friendly?
The bulk of it was, we want to make a human connection with him because we believe that that is essential for future policy gains. We can talk about what those policy objectives were for this crew because I think they're pretty limited, but they were significant at the time. And certainly they were significant to present to a Republican presidential candidate who would become president. But in the hour-long meeting, this 12 had decided beforehand, we are going to lead with our biographies. We are going to present ourselves as people. And so each of the 12 took a couple of minutes to just talk about who they were. And it was, you know, one of them talked about how their lesbian sister had adopted three children and how important it was that the gay families could help adopt children who other American families were not adopting. Now, this was an important story to tell because as governor of Texas, Bush had supported legislation that banned gay families from being part of the state's foster system, also had supported legislation that basically limited or really restricted gay people from adopting children at all within the state of Texas. So that was an important story. Another person talked about his deep Roman Catholic faith and how he and his husband were, you know, regular churchgoers. And so sort of on and on and on to present themselves as quote unquote normal, as just like George Bush in many ways. And then after that had been established, to ask for a couple of policy goals, which mostly involved not turning back things that Clinton had done. Yeah. They weren't really out on a limb saying like, we want you to be the president that calls for same-sex marriage, or we want you to expand LGBTQ rights, as much as we just don't want you to attack us. We don't want you to go after us. We don't want you to undo the gains that have been made. And mostly we want to establish a relationship here by which we can grow some policy goals in the years ahead.
Which is, you know, often how change happens. I mean, people, all people and politicians too, I think rightfully so, kind of often talk about a personal connection being a thing that changes their understanding and leads to policy change. So, you know, I get that strategy, and I also understand that there's a political calculus there, which, you know, I want to get to. And so actually on that front, I mean, I hinted in the intro to the fact that like some of the other candidates in that 2000 race were extending olive branches, so to speak, to gay Republican voters. I mean, did Bush catch flack for this meeting, or how did it come across?
A little bit. I mean, the important thing is by the time of this meeting, Bush has won the Republican primary. So it's a sort of safe calculation of his. And in fact, it's a strategic one. Bush had refused through the primaries to actually meet with the National Office of Log Cabin Republicans. The national office headquarters, and in fact, the bulk of gay Republicans in the primaries supported John McCain. John McCain had a better record on a lot of these issues. He actually had a long-standing relationship with Log Cabin. They were allies and had a history of communication already. Log Cabin had raised $40,000 for him. So Bush was able to play that very perfectly. by saying like, well, I don't want to meet with these folks because they've endorsed McCain. They hadn't endorsed McCain, but he's fudging to make it look like he's not doing it for the reasons that he wasn't doing it, which is that he didn't want to antagonize his religious right base. However, once the primary is over, he's feeling like he can be a little bit of a different candidate. His strategy team wants him to start presenting himself differently on the national stage than he was, when he was appealing to the Republican base. And this is very much about like going after those sort of suburban voters, the moderates, independents. And it's believed that this meeting is an important part of that, is an important part of sort of expanding the notion of what compassionate conservatism is, especially in terms of how the national media treats it. And the national media loved this event. Right. I mean, they glowingly report on it in the New York Times and in the Washington Post and everywhere else. There's big photographs taken of it, of, Bush shaking the hand of one of them and having this press conference afterwards, with all smiles. So it plays really well. There's the normal pushback from some religious right folks, but it doesn't really blow up into anything major. It certainly doesn't cost Bush any votes in terms of the upcoming election.
It's also to me, such an interesting sea change that is happening in U.S. politics at the time, because it's in the 1992 election when Bill Clinton courts the LGBTQ vote. And I think he's the first Democratic president to do that openly, right? Dukakis had distanced himself from LGBTQ voters, and Clinton openly courts them and disappoints them at many times throughout his presidency. And I wonder if we're seeing with Bush, maybe not quite the same process that we were seeing with Clinton, because it's not like Bush is going after the gay Republican vote. He's simply taking this moment to meet with them. But he's opening a door, I think, that it's kind of hard to imagine being opened, certainly during the 90s, during the years where the Christian coalition is so dominant.
That's right. And it's interesting because gay Republicans during the Clinton years really go after him as a hypocrite. And they're on good ground for that, right? Like you use us for our votes, you use us for our fundraising, but you turn on us. You support Don't Ask, Don't Tell. You continue to say that you don't support the extension of marriage rights. You're all talk and you're exploitive. And Republicans maybe aren't much better on those issues, but we're better on, the economy and on crime and national security. And if we want to move forward, we would do well not to continue to support this party that just gives us lip service, but to start changing this other party and to from within both parties, make gay rights less controversial and ideally make it a bipartisan issue. And so that's the sort of argument they're using. But it's interesting because the strategy that they're taking is not that dissimilar than what gay Democrats have been doing on the other side, in earlier years, which is like, we're going to start building a relationship. We're going to get you to symbolically look different. And then from there, we'll start hopefully changing policy goals.
Hey there, Jody here, and I'm excited to tell you that one of our favorite Radiotopia siblings, Ear Hustle, is back with a brand new season. This is their 13th season, and the show just keeps getting better. Now, I don't know if you know, but Ear Hustle is the show about life inside prison, but it is not your typical prison podcast. Co-hosts Nigel Poor and Earlonne Woods have recently been spending time at 4 California prisons, and now they have a season's worth of funny, surprising, and unforgettable stories to share. In a recent episode, they were able to visit a groundbreaking prison hospice where they spoke to men who are grappling with the reality of dying inside prison. Also coming up this season are stories about the objects people keep inside their prison cells, complicated mom-daughter relationships inside prison, and stories of incarcerated people who wonder whether they've become too comfortable behind bars. These are stories about life on the inside told by those who live it. I'll be listening, and I hope you will too. Find Ear Hustle wherever you get your podcasts. I'm curious if there actually were electoral implications here. I mean, I read that the Times referred to this as a sliver of the vote. My favorite kind of quote from this whole thing is that a pollster for George W. Bush in the spring of 2000, Fred Steeper, says, "I don't think this election is going to be decided by the gay vote. It's not going to be that close." This is the 2000 election. Neil, do you know how many gay Republican voters there were in Broward County, Florida that fall?
In fact, I do.
Okay.
Well, we don't know necessarily in Broward County, Florida, but we know that 60,000 gay and lesbian Floridians voted for Bush in a state that he won by only 537 votes.
There you go.
So Florida is significant here, obviously, in this election, and 60,000 gay and lesbian Floridians voting for Bush in an election that came down to a couple hundred votes is significant. And also, Log Cabin poured its efforts into the state of Florida leading up to the 2000 election. Over the summer, the Log Cabin team spent a lot of money on ads in key districts across the country, touting Bush as a gay-friendly person, really sort of giving that expansive notion of compassionate conservatism. And Florida especially was a place they put a lot of ad dollars into. And I think all of that was focused on South Florida. So I think it's not insignificant, even as it was a small vote overall. It certainly played a part in the state of Florida that we know was so consequential.
Wow. I mean, so much of this is resonant to the conversation happening right now about Black Trump voters, right? And Latino Trump voters.
I was just thinking the same thing.
And how really those numbers were sort of significant in making the last election very close. And people are looking at this election being incredibly close. And these little slivers and pockets of, these marginal edges and advantages are huge. And so, Neil, on that front, I mean, if we want to take a step back about gay Republican voters. I'm so fascinated by the title of your book, right, which is Coming Out Republican, right? And so there's
not a memoir.
What's that?
Not a memoir.
Not a memoir. But, but it hints at the fact that, a gay Republican voter has to come out in sort of two ways from sort of maybe opposite directions. And so I'm just curious if you can talk a little bit about that dynamic as a either political force or just as a kind of like social force.
Yeah, maybe the best way to get at that is to talk about the origin of Log Cabin Republicans, which is in the late 1970s. Log Cabin Republicans as a national organization is formed around 1990, but it's formed 12 to 13 years after all these grassroots organizations began, mostly in California, in San Francisco and Los Angeles, in response to the Briggs Initiative, which y'all have probably talked about before on here, but just for a reminder, the Briggs Initiative was a state ballot proposition in California that was part of the 1978 election that would have made it illegal for gay or lesbian persons to work in California's public school system. And this infuriated gay Republicans. They thought, how dare this guy, John Briggs, he was a religious right sort of early figure from Orange County, California. How dare he come into our party and this party of liberty and equality and of freedom and try and take people's lives and livelihood away from them, their way of making money, their profession, because of his bigotry. And so a lot of these guys came out of the closet in order to form these early gay Republican organizations. So they were both coming out, as you say, personally, letting more of their friends know, and in terms of a public profile where they were starting these grassroots groups, they were, organizing, they were becoming politically active, they were canvassing, they were aligning themselves with Republican Party officials in San Francisco and in Los Angeles. They were identifying themselves in the public press. This was a big deal to do in the late 1970s. And so, yes, it was a double coming out, especially in that origin moment, but one I think that we see really through the 1980s and 1990s when it's hard for us to remember how difficult it was for so many Americans to come out at all. To their family, to their friends, to their coworkers, let alone to come out in this sort of public way and to identify themselves, in newspapers as political activists and within their own party. This is the way that so many of them become politically engaged and start working in the Republican system and start networking and building relationships. And they're doing that as out gay Republicans. I disagree with these guys a lot when it comes to politics and policy, but I really admire so many of them, especially in these years, because what they were doing was really brave and took a ton of courage, and they faced horrible reactions and responses time and time again, but they stuck to it.
So I'm curious, Kellie's co-host on another podcast, Leah Wright-Rigueur, has written this book about the loneliness of the Black Republican. And I do think that sometimes there is this sense of you're betraying the Black community by voting Republican. And I would assume that that dynamic is sort of the other side of the coming out that I think Jody was referring to, that idea that like you're coming out as a Republican in a group that's pretty strongly coded as liberal and democratic. Like what kind of backlash do these gay Republicans face from within the LGBT community?
Huge backlash, but that backlash changes over time and it actually develops over time. In the late 1970s, almost every gay activist who was on the left really supported the development of these organizations because they believed in the very argument these gay Republicans were making, which is that we need to be in both parties. We need to make gay rights a bipartisan issue. We need to work within the broader political system to advance, to move things forward. And in fact, Harvey Milk in California, in San Francisco, was deeply involved in the creation of the Gay Republican Organization in San Francisco. He was at the original meeting that founded the first gay Republican organization, which at the time was called Concerned Republicans for Individual Rights. It eventually renames itself Log Cabin Republicans of San Francisco, as they all come under sort of the log cabin umbrella. But Harvey Milk had been at the beginning of this group's founding because he said there's a lot of gay guys in San Francisco who are attorneys and insurance executives and entrepreneurs, and they are voting Republican already. They're voting with their pocketbooks, so they might as well also operate as an organized out constituency of gay Republicans to show that party, hey, we're here already. And we're going to change the party from within. However, as things progress, as the Republican Party really becomes so anti-gay in the 1980s and 1990s, that message, that idea really starts shifting on the LGBTQ left. And I would say more broadly in the LGBTQ rights movement of like, what are you guys doing? You're hypocrites, you're sellouts, you're self-hating saps. And over time, that becomes something that gay Republicans sort of challenge at first. Like, how dare you say this? You say you're a message and a movement of tolerance and inclusion and diversity, and you're antagonizing us. We want to be part of this larger community. To something that I write about really in more recent time, in the Trump era, this becomes sort of a badge by which gay Republicans or the LGBTQ right sort of stakes its claim or stakes its place within the Trump Republican Party. They don't like us because we're Republicans. They don't like us because we're conservatives. It was harder for us to come out as a Republican than to come out as gay. That's something folks on Fox News like to say all the time. And of course, that's a way of sort of shoring up conservative grievance and downplaying LGBTQ identity.
Same thing in the Black community.
Sure,
it is the exact same thing. And it's interesting, I think, in this election too, where more and more Black people are sort of seeing themselves on a Trump ticket, how people rationalize or make sense of the decisions that they're making or the leaders that they are sort of voting for.
Yeah, and Kellie, I don't know if this is the case with Black Trump supporters, but part of what the rhetoric is doing among LGBTQ Trump supporters, it's also to say that the LGBTQ rights movement is over. It's done. It's finished. We got marriage. We're allowed to serve the military. You can't fire us from our job. Case closed, dismissed. We can move on. We don't have to deal with that anymore. So it's a way of both sort of asserting a place of belonging within the right or within the larger conservative movement. It's a way of shoring up, I would say, white conservative grievance politics. And it's also a way of declaring LGBTQ rights are over. Stop it. That's just a sort of, the left is always going to continue to push things. They'll never be happy with stuff, but it has been achieved. We can move on.
That's
wow. Wow.
I mean, you're sort of hinting at it here, but I kind of, as we wrap up, I'm just curious if you could say a little bit more about 2024. And, I'm thinking about where we started in 2000, how so much of the conversation was about, for lack of a better word, kind of tone, right? And I think we're now back to a moment where the Republican Party seems to have just thrown the idea of kind of civility and tone and sort of compassionate rhetoric out the window. And are any of those concerns coming back at all? And to put a little sharper edge on it too, I think the Republican Party, in addition to just sort of coarsening its rhetoric, is also really pushing back about anything that smacks of kind of identity-based politics.
Right.
And so I wonder if there's any of those same things that were bubbling in 2000. Do you see that coming back at all in 2024?
Hardly at all. And I think that speaks to how much Trump has transformed everything within the Republican Party, and gay Republicans are very much within that transformation and have helped accommodate and even bring about that transformation. One of the things that I really argue in the book is that for most of this history, gay Republicans operate, and especially log cabin Republicans, they operate as a thorn in the side of the Republican Party. We are here to agitate you into doing the right thing. We're here to hold your feet to the fire. We're here to call you out on the homophobic, anti-gay policies and language you're putting forward. The Never Trump small faction of log cabin left the organization, and it became a completely in the tank pro-Trump group through the first administration, and they're lining up very wholeheartedly for his reelection, even as the politics are so ugly, even as the rhetoric is so gross. And, one of the things that I think has been really telling is their support for Ron DeSantis. Now, they've started to push back to him because it's getting really vicious there. And they're realizing that the sort of opening policy goals Ron DeSantis had, which they thought were sort of discreet and limited, were in fact not discreet and limited, but were the stepping stones to a broader assault on LGBTQ rights. So you see them scrambling a bit. But a lot of this is consistent with a history in which they maybe go after Republicans at the congressional level or the state and local level, but they sort of fall in line with the guy at the top of the ticket, the presidential ticket. And I think this organization is very much in the tank for Trump, and it's going to be out in front, as they were in the 2020 election, to wash his reputation and to present him as gay-friendly, and sort of all the rhetoric we saw in 2020 about him being the most pro-gay president in U.S. history. I think we're going to hear a lot of that again in 2024.
Interesting. All right. Well, we are going to leave it there, but this is really fascinating. Neil J. Young. The book is coming out, Republican, A History of the Gay Right. And I know we were just focusing here on the 21st century, basically, but I mean, you go all the way back into the 50s in this book to trace it. And so maybe if you want to find another moment that you think is fascinating, you'll come back on and talk about something from the 50s or 60s, maybe. But
I'd love that. Thank you so
Neil,
much.
Thank you so much for doing this. It's great, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.